This is why it sucks to be Nike right now. For 40 years, Nike taught the world to just do it, and for the last 2 years it has failed at the one thing it was built for, which is selling more shoes than it sold the year before. Revenue has been sliding, sales in Greater China have fallen for the better part of 2 years, and by the middle of 2026 the stock had sunk to an 11-year low, down roughly a third in this year alone, and worth less than a third of its late 2021 peak. On June 30, 2026, Nike reported another quarter its own managers had already warned would be ugly, with revenue guided lower again and China expected to drop around 20%. The strange part is that Nike did not lose to some unbeatable new giant. It lost a step to running brands most shoppers had barely heard of 5 years earlier, and it did it while chasing a strategy that was supposed to make it richer. This is the story of how the biggest name in sport spent its own dominance, trading the thing that made it untouchable for a financial shortcut that hollowed it out from the inside. To understand how it talked itself into this corner, you have to go back to the year it was nearly strangled by its own success. Nike almost died in the late 1970s, not from weak sales, but from growing too fast to pay for them. Founded in January of 1964 as Blue Ribbon Sports by the track coach Bill Bowerman and his former runner Phil Knight, the business spent its early years importing Japanese running shoes from a brand called Onitsuka Tiger and selling them out of a car trunk at track meets. In 1971, Knight broke away from his supplier, launched his own brand under the name Nike, after the Greek goddess of victory, and paid a design student named Carolyn Davidson $35 for the swoosh that now sits on billions of products. The danger was buried in the math underneath the growth. Blue Ribbon had to pay its Japanese factories before its own retailers ever paid it, so every jump in sales demanded a bigger bank loan rather than a bigger cushion, which meant success itself kept dragging the company toward the edge. By the end of the decade, its bank, First National of Oregon, decided it had seen enough and moved to cut off the company's credit entirely, leaving Nike one bad phone call away from collapse. Rescue arrived from a Japanese trading house called Nisho Iwai, which stepped in to cover Nike's debts and keep the shoes flowing. Years later, once the company was worth a fortune, Knight handed Davidson a gold swoosh ring and shares of stock, a quiet thank you for the $35 logo that survival had made priceless. Nike became the most valuable name in sport by selling something far bigger than footwear, which was the private feeling of winning. The turning point arrived in 1984, when the company gambled on a rookie guard named Michael Jordan and built an entire line around him, releasing the first Air Jordan the next year against the wishes of a league that fined his team for the shoes that broke its color rules, penalties Nike happily paid. The fine became an advertising campaign, the controversy became a legend, and Air Jordan grew into a business worth billions entirely on its own. 4 years later, Nike distilled its whole philosophy into 3 words, when the 1988 Just Do It campaign turned a shoe company into something close to a secular religion about effort and ambition. The pattern repeated with almost every sport it touched, from signing a young Tiger Woods in 1996 to dressing national teams and Olympic champions, until the swoosh stood for excellence itself rather than any single shoe. For the next 3 decades, Nike pulled off what almost no consumer brand manages. It stayed the biggest and the coolest at the same time, signing the best athletes and inventing the most wanted shoes while annual sales climbed into the tens of billions. Ordinary buyers came to believe that a pair of sneakers was a small promise about who they might become. By late 2021, that belief had carried the stock to an all-time high near $179, behind a swoosh so dominant it no longer needed a name printed beside it. A company like that carries one quiet weakness: it only stays a religion for as long as it keeps handing the believers something new to believe in. The first crack in that belief was entirely self-inflicted, and it came from a decision to stop selling through almost everybody else. In 2020, Nike bet its future on going direct to the consumer. A new chief executive named John Donahoe had arrived from the world of tech and consulting rather than from sport, and he pushed sales through Nike's own apps and stores while cutting loose much of the wholesale network that had carried the brand for decades. Nike walked away from major retail partners, including a very public break with Foot Locker, and set out to make direct sales the majority of its business, gambling that customers would follow the swoosh wherever it went, and that the fatter margins of selling alone would more than cover the lost shelf space. To keep its own stores stocked while genuine innovation slowed to a crawl, the company leaned hard on its own archives, re-releasing old favorites like the Air Force One and the Dunk again and again, until the once coveted became ordinary, and the magic of scarcity quietly drained out of them. The plan carried one fatal flaw in its timing. Nike gave up the shelves before its direct business was ready to replace them, and it stopped inventing at the precise moment it most needed something fresh, which left a wide gap on the wall of nearly every shoe store in the country. Rival brands were more than happy to fill it. The companies that walked through that gap were the ones Nike had barely bothered to watch. A Swiss upstart called On, backed by the tennis legend Roger Federer, and a once tiny running label named Hoka, owned by Deckers, turned themselves into the names that serious runners and casual shoppers suddenly wanted on their feet. By Nike's 2026 fiscal year, Hoka alone was generating around $2.5 billion a year and still growing by double digits, while On's quarterly sales climbed by more than 30%. In American running shoes, the newcomers grew so fast that Hoka and Brooks each commanded roughly a quarter of the market Nike once treated as its birthright. The oldest rival landed the sharpest blow of all because Adidas came roaring back on the strength of retro classics like the Samba and the Gazelle, and in 2024 its shares rose almost 30% in the same year Nike's fell more than 30%. The Samba turned up on celebrities and ordinary sidewalks alike, an everyday staple that Nike simply had no answer for, and the comeback handed Adidas its strongest momentum with retailers in years. For the first time in a generation, the Swoosh was no longer automatically the coolest thing in the room, and the brand that had spent decades dictating what people wanted on their feet was suddenly reading the trends instead of setting them. Cool is the one asset Nike could never put on a balance sheet, and it was leaking away to every rival at once. While those rivals climbed, Nike's own numbers turned ugly in almost every market that mattered. Greater China, long the company's most important engine of growth, went into open reverse. Sales there fell quarter after quarter, 6 straight times with no sign of a floor, and management warned the latest drop would reach around 20%. The damage spread straight through the financial statements. Revenue slid toward $11 billion in a recent quarter, profit fell by more than a third from the year before, and gross margin slipped toward 40% as the company marked down piles of unsold inventory just to clear them. For a brand whose entire premium rested on selling desire rather than discounts, every markdown chipped away at the one thing the stock was really priced on. New tariffs piled on roughly $1.5 billion in added costs across the fiscal year, and even Converse, the sneaker icon Nike owns outright, saw its sales drop by about 30% in a single quarter. There were a few real signs of life, as the running category grew at a healthy clip, and the rebuilt wholesale business in North America climbed by double digits, yet none of it was enough to outrun Upstarts expanding even faster from a smaller base. Once a trendsetter, the company was now reacting to everyone else, discounting last season's shoes while its competitors sold this season's at full price, and the brand built on relentless forward motion spent its days clearing the backlog piled up behind it. A business that had always grown its way out of trouble suddenly had no growth left to spend. Nike's answer was to bring back a man who had spent his whole career inside the building, and his rescue plan quietly admits how much had already been lost. In the autumn of 2024, the board pushed Donahoe out and handed the company to Elliott Hill, a 32-year Nike veteran who had actually retired before being called back to repair what an outsider had broken. Hill's strategy, which the company calls Win Now, largely amounts to undoing the previous one, rebuilding the wholesale partnerships Nike had abandoned and walking back into the very stores it had walked out of only a few years before. The cleanup ran deeper than strategy, because Nike had already moved to strip out around $2 billion in costs and lay off more than 1,600 employees, roughly 2% of its workforce, at a restructuring charge of some $400 million. Those very layoffs later drew a federal investigation after a Trump-appointed official at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission opened a probe into whether the company's diversity policies had discriminated against white workers. A separate shareholder lawsuit accused Donahoe and his finance chief of misleading investors about how well the direct-to-consumer bet was actually going. Hill's own lieutenants have described parts of the business as a low point and warned investors that the recovery would get worse before it got better. The market met the turnaround with open doubt. The stock sat at an 11-year low, down roughly a third across 2026, a long fall from the $179 a share it had crossed less than 5 years earlier. On June 30, 2026, Nike delivered yet another quarter it had already warned would hurt. Begging your old partners to take you back is not the posture of a company that still dictates the culture. Which brings us back to why it really sucks to be Nike right now. The company built its empire by out-inventing everyone and selling the entire world on relentless reinvention, and then it tried to win the way a spreadsheet would, trading the slow work of making something new for the fast math of selling directly and reissuing the past. The strategy that was supposed to make Nike richer instead made it ordinary, holding the door open for a Swiss running brand, a California challenger, and an old German rival to take the territory the Swoosh had owned for 40 years. Here is the cruel part. The very thing that made Nike, an instinct for the next great shoe, and the cultural cool that always came with it, is the one thing a turnaround plan cannot simply order back into existence. Nike spent 4 decades telling the whole world to just do it, and its hardest discovery now is that the command was never as easy to follow as the slogan made it sound. The company has to prove all over again that it can still do the only thing it ever truly sold, which is win, and for the first time in a generation nobody is entirely certain that it can.